When I was a student nurse, I worked at an aged care facility. One night shift, I was doing my final rounds before leaving for the night. I entered the room of one of the female residents, and she's sitting on her bed staring at me. I encourage her to get to bed, and she looks at me and states she doesn't want to go to sleep because the man will just wake her up anyway. I ask her what she means, and she explains that at night time, a man walks down the corridor and he comes into her room. She tells me that he stands in the room and stares at her. I reassure her that she is safe, and it's a secure facility, and there's no one here that shouldn't be here, and I help her into bed and leave. Fast forward a few nights, and I learn that this resident is still not sleeping at night because of the man that wakes her up. Towards the end of my shift at around 11, I'm doing my rounds again and hear the same resident call out. I rush to the room thinking she's fallen and find her sitting on the bed. She tells me that the man had just been in her room again, and I ask her to describe the man, as we had male nurses and carers on site at the time as well. I thought she may have seen one of them walk past her room, and she describes an older man with grey hair and a big scar on his cheek. I sit with her until she settles, and I leave. The next day, I talk with one of the nurses about the incident the night before, and explain how she described the man. When I mention the scar, the nurse stops and looks at me. She states that the man in the room before her had a scar on his cheek and died in his sleep 2 weeks prior to her arriving to the facility. So there is no way that the current resident would have met the gentleman. She then goes on to say that when he was alive, he would just wander the corridors. This freaked me out a bit, as part of my job was essentially to walk around the facility in the dark, checking in on residents. A night later, she stopped complaining about the man in her room. In 2013, I had to have my gallbladder removed. It had been a hellish few weeks, lots of pain and discomfort, and the doctors had a hard time figuring out what was wrong at first, and I ended up with the flu in the middle of all of it. I got to the hospital and prepped for surgery. They gave me the night-night juice, and the last thing I remember before passing out was the anesthesiologist running into the room and shouting, "Is anyone else aware that he's in full kidney failure?" When I woke up, I was in a recovery room, and a completely unknown doctor was rubbing my hand. My family wasn't there, and she explained that my surgery had gone well, but my kidneys had failed. I burst into tears of part terror, part disorientation. My aunt had kidney problems all her life, and had finally had a transplant the year before. So all I could think about was that I was going to have a kidney transplant. Long story short, my flu had dehydrated me. The blood pressure medication I was on, thanks genetics, had affected me adversely, and the pain medication I was taking for the gallbladder had all wreaked havoc on my kidneys. A perfect storm. My creatinine levels were through the roof, and at some point my kidneys had just stopped working, but I had been too sick to notice. 3 days later, after massive rehydration and new medication, my kidneys both bounced back, and I am alive to tell the tale. Scariest moments of my life. My wife used to work in an assisted care facility. I worked about 20 minutes away for a collection of radio stations, part-time, but really crappy hours. I went to take her to lunch one day, and she said she was ready to go, but by the time I had parked in her lot, someone had come to get her for something that they needed, so I had to sit in the reception area in a big, high-backed chair. I was annoyed and tired, because if I recall, I'd been up since 3 or 4 a.m. and a resident, a guy around 70 to 75 in a wheelchair, came out with his son. They were looking for my wife, as she worked at the front desk and did some other inventory management stuff. So the resident began tapping on the bell at the desk. Now I'm sure he was a nice guy. He seemed nice, but he was tapping it and making jokes about how slow people were around here. But they weren't particularly mean comments. I did get quite annoyed though, because that's my wife you're making fun of, and she works really hard and works lots of hours, and I was tired and cranky. I didn't say anything though. I didn't even think they knew I was there. I think I was playing a game on my phone. I just kept my head down for a bit and said nothing, and the guy stopped shortly after, and he and his son just decided to move on for a bit. A while later, I closed my phone and was sitting in the same chair quietly, slumped down with my eyes closed. The chair faces away from the front desk, but I could hear someone coming in and recognized the same voices of the resident and his son. The gentleman rang the bell again, but instead of ringing it repeatedly, just rang it once and then patiently waited. This is where it got weird. The resident said to his son, "What happened to that gentleman who was sitting in the chair earlier? Did you see him?" Their son responds back, "No, I didn't see him." He sounded like he was being patient, like his dad asked him odd things all the time, and he was just responding to respond. The patient says, "Oh, I was just wondering where he went." Ruth said he apparently didn't care for me much, didn't like me ringing the bell or something, and he chuckled. Not gonna lie, I've seen some stuff in my day having done paranormal investigations for over a decade, but I was kind of blown away. I'm skeptic of psychics and people who say they speak to the dead, but I wasn't sure how this guy could have known that. My mum was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer in 2009. It was a struggle, and the doctors didn't expect her to pull through, but she did, like a champ. My mum is a fighter, and as she puts it, refused to let cancer kick her ass. Fast forward to 2012, and she decided to undergo reconstructive surgery. This surgery goes well, and she is put into recovery. She spends a day drifting in and out of consciousness, which was expected after a surgery like that. The whole time, she is still hooked up to a morphine drip to help her pain. After being reassured by the doctors that everything was fine, we decided to go to our homes and shower and sleep. My sister, though, elected to stay just in case anything went down. Fast forward to the next morning, and my sister is calling me in tears, saying I needed to get to the hospital right now. I rush up to the hospital and am pulled aside by the doctors and told that my mum has suffered some complications from the surgery and is in a coma. A half hour goes by and my stepdad arrives, and the doctors pull him and I into a room, and they say that her lungs are filling with fluid at a fast rate. They say she is unlikely to recover, and we need to make a decision to keep her on life support or to pull the plug. We refuse to let her go like that. 3 days go by, and my mum starts showing some cognitive activity, and by the end of the week, she fully wakes up. The relevant part happens after she awoke. She looks at my stepdad and I, and asks when we came into the room. We tell her we've been here all week. She seemed really dumbfounded, and replied that she'd only been in the room for a day or two, She then asks where her grandmother had gone. This specifically creeped us out. My great-grandmother passed away in early 2007. When my stepdad tried to explain this to her, she replied that she had spent the last couple of days with her talking about the family. She said that Grandma got really weird and told her that she can't give up because she had children to take care of. According to my mum, around the time Grandma said this, Mum became aware of us being in the room, and Grandma was gone. It wasn't really weird to hear her talk about it, and to this day she has no recollection of being in a coma. She knows she was now, but all that she can remember is spending a few days in the hospital with my grandmother, just talking about the family. I had been a nurse for a number of years back home in the States, and after a few things happened in my life to give me some fresh perspective, I wanted to do something a little different. So I volunteered with a charity and became a relief nurse in a third world country. I don't want to say where exactly it was for privacy reasons, but it was very remote to say the least, and the hospital building we were in was tiny. We had just about enough to get by, but there were always so many people in need of assistance. You can't even imagine how long they had to wait. I felt so sorry for some of them, but this was a free charity-run hospital, and we were insanely understaffed. Anyway, the reason I wanted to share this story is because of what I experienced in that hospital. I'd start to notice that the local nurses and doctors would avoid the back part of the hospital as much as they could. Whether it be walking there, allocating patients there, they desperately try and not send anyone that way, unless they were very near death. That's something I picked on quite quickly. After working there for a few months, I finally asked, more out of curiosity, why exactly they did that. One of the nurses then went all hush-hush on me and pulled me in to a storage closet. She turned on the light and said to me in hushed tones that they didn't like sending anyone in the back because that's where the death is. The death being a translation of what the word was. I asked her to elaborate, and she said that many years ago when this hospital first opened, there was a nurse who worked here who got pregnant illegitimately with the child of a doctor. She had the baby in the hospital, and the doctor refused to acknowledge it was his child. The nurse was furious, so she confessed of the secret affair to his wife. His wife, however, refused to believe her, and in her desperation, one day came into work and hanged herself in the back of the hospital. That story really got to me, and for a moment I stood there dumbfounded and confused, and asked her if this was true. She nodded and told me to be careful, and said that the reason they didn't like sending anyone back there is because people have seen her, and her spirit is vengeful, and they feel that when they put healthy people at the end of the hospital, they slowly start to deteriorate, and in some cases have even died, and that it's not worth the risk. Please bear in mind that I have been a complete skeptic for my entire life, and had never experienced anything remotely paranormal to convince me otherwise. I nod, mostly out of respect, and say that I won't go back there anymore, unless necessary. So, that was that, and life went on. I never saw any spooky happenings, but it was always in the back of my mind, especially when going down there in the dark. Now, as this was relief work, I did have a fair bit more work than I usually would, but I was enjoying it. And at one point, I'd been asked to work the night shift, which, being a night owl, I gladly took up. It was actually a lot better for me. Less people were coming in, the staff were just as nice, but I got on a bit more better with them than the others, which was always a bonus. That's where I met Julia. Me and Julia got talking, and one day I asked her if she'd heard the ghost story of the hospital. She told me that she had, but only after she witnessed something. I asked her if she cared to elaborate, and she told me that one day she was pushing someone in a gurney towards one of the back rooms, when she saw a shadow pass by the hallway. As she entered the T section of the hallway, she turned to the left, and there was a shadow still walking away. Her eyes followed it for a moment, but it vanished. Her heart dropped to the floor, and she ran all the way to the room. Apparently she stayed in there for a good 10 minutes, too terrified to leave, and the patient saw it too, and was pretty freaked out as well. She tried not to talk about it, but when she returned to the nurses' station, the other nurses instantly knew what had happened, as there's only one reason why you go so white in the face after coming back from the end of the hallway. Although I found her story interesting, I still wasn't moved, and assumed it must have been a shadow, a reflection of the light, and that it was simply impossible. 2 months down the line though, all of that changed. We had a patient who wasn't in the best of sorts. We were treating him after his leg had to be amputated. Cancer does that. And I was asked to take him to the back of the hospital. So I did. We barely had enough rooms, and we were pretty much full at that time. As I was taking him over there, I looked around and saw nothing, always keeping caution in mind, just in case I was wrong. I get him set up in his room, and he seems quite content. And so, I ask him if there's any more he needs of me, and he says no and turns on his TV. Small TV, might I add. As I walk out and prepare to return to the nurses' station, I feel a cold chill behind me. Bear in mind this was a very warm country, so although a cold chill was usually welcome, it was incredibly unexpected. I turn around and see nothing, and when I look back to continue walking to where I was going, that's when I see something. A shadow, clear as day, strutting along the hallway. I freeze. I blink my eyes, and the shadow still proceeds. Then I see it walk into the room at the end. I absolutely lost my shit and ran back to the nurses' station. I remember the clacking of my shoes as I made my way over sound heavily in the hallway, echoing, alerting the other nurses of my presence. One of the nurses, who were already told I didn't believe the story, gave me a little smirk and said that I'd seen her too. All I could do was nod, and after a while managed to inform them that he went into room 119. One of the nurses looked up at me, panicked, because she knew that was her patient. After about 10 minutes of calming down, the nurse went over to check. Sure enough, he had passed. He was already about to expire anyway, so it wasn't that much of a surprise, but it was slightly earlier than we had anticipated, as we thought he still had a few good days in him. Nonetheless, that changed my perception about the paranormal. I only saw her one other time when I was working there, and again, it was from a bit far off, and it gave me serious spooks. I'm glad I did the relief work, but I wasn't all that comfortable in that hospital. I kept in contact with some of the nurses and found out that a few years later the hospital was demolished and replaced by a big, new, better equipped hospital that was state of the art, which was absolutely fantastic for the area. I really hope the nurse or the spirit or whatever it was doesn't choose to come and find this new place. I had acne scarring and hated it. I read medical articles and managed to learn about something called chemical peels. I was intrigued, so I went to a plastic surgeon and asked him if he did chemical peels. He said he'd never done one, but had heard about the procedure and was willing to give it a go. I gave him a book with a bit of information, and a few weeks later went to a private hospital for my peel. I should add that this type of peel is rarely conducted these days. It's a very deep peel, bearing no resemblance to the usual peels which are most often conducted now, and which are no way near as deep as the ones I had. The doctor told me it would be cheaper if he didn't perform the chemical peel in theatre, and he fitted me in between doing a boob job and an ear surgery. My procedure was conducted in a storeroom, all true, and the doctor made himself comfortable on a stack of packs of toilet paper. With him there were 2 nursing sisters who'd been with him earlier that day doing the boob and ear jobs. They were fooling around like little kids when the teacher was out the room. I had to lie on a lowered gurney with my head literally on the doctor's lap. He placed the chemical peel liquid, which was in a very small bowl, onto my chest before he began applying the chemical solution. He said in a very matter-of-fact way that I should be more concerned about getting a boob job than about a few scars on my face. Then he began applying the chemical peel solution using a cotton tip. The pain hit after about 30 seconds. Indescribable pain. But I couldn't move because there was a bowl full of the acid sitting precariously on my chest. I was silently screaming for 10 minutes before one of the nurses realized something was wrong. Actually, it was when a splash of the chemical solution burnt her hand that she worked it out and went dashing out of the storeroom to wash it off, cursing like mad. Every touch of the chemical-soaked cotton tip felt like a deep knife slash, a very slow slash. The nurse returned to the storeroom and said to the doctor, "She needs pain relief. That stuff hurts like no one's business." But the doctor replied in a bored voice, "I'm nearly done though. No point giving her anything at this point." So the nurses each held one of my hands for consolation. They'd asked me if the stuff was hurting me, and I could only reply by making a groaning sound. One of them wrenched her hand away from me, as apparently I had been crushing it in my pain. Afterwards, I was wheeled into a room and left alone, and the pain must have kicked in because I needed to vomit. There was nothing there I could use, so I leaned over to vomit into a waste paper basket. I must have passed out, and the next I knew, a nurse was calling out in panic, and it woke me up. I was at that point still hanging head first over the side of the bed. No idea how long I'd been like that. She was staring straight at me in horror, and asked me if I'd been burnt in an accident. I couldn't speak. I felt as if my tongue was swollen. The doctor had only booked me in for one night, so next morning I was asked to leave. A nurse found a scarf from somewhere and told me I could use it to cover my face. A friend came to collect me, very tactful friend, but even though she tried not to react, her shock and disgust were palpable. When I got home, I saw that my face looked like a cow's liver that had been under a grill for far too long. It was crusty, purple, red, and already weeping out of the cracks in the toasted liver surface. I wore a scarf over my face for 2 weeks, to walk my children to school and at any point I was outside. I was beyond mortification at that point. Naturally, everyone stared at me and talked about me. The full-face, thick scab drove me crazy with itching, so I used to stand under the shower trying to pluck chunks of my scab off. My father's second wife was a nursing sister and dropped by one day. I hadn't told anyone I was having the chemical peel, so she was shocked by the situation in which she found me. She phoned the surgery of the doctor who performed the chemical peel and tore strips off him for not arranging any aftercare or medication, such as antibiotics and antihistamines. I should also mention at this point that when the nurse at the hospital discovered me passed out over the wastepaper basket, she asked me if my face hurt. I nodded that it did, but because my doctor hadn't prescribed any pain relief medication before going on holiday, the nurses weren't even allowed to give me aspirin. Finally, the scabs fell off, leaving my skin tight and shiny and bright red. It took a few months to cool down to something approaching a normal colour. In subsequent talks with my doctor, he said that because he'd never conducted a chemical peel before, he hadn't realised it would be painful. It made me laugh to read in a leading women's magazine a few years later that the same doctor, who was now the head of plastic surgery in my country, warned people about chemical peels, that they were dangerous, and because of the chemicals, including a derivative of creosote, can be absorbed, they had the potential to destroy the kidneys, and in fact, had been implicated in several deaths worldwide. For this reason, he said in the article, such peels should only be conducted by experienced surgeons under full anesthetic because of the pain factor, and require intense follow-up and monitoring and treatment. There's more though, including a second chemical peel conducted by the same doctor at the same hospital, again unsuccessfully. But to continue would only testify to the desperation to rid myself of acne scarring at the cost of potential death, definite pain, and insane trust in the doctor's promise that he'd take the procedure and me more seriously next time, when clearly that doctor was a cocaine-addicted sadist who nonetheless rose to the highest position possible in my country that a plastic surgeon could ever hope to attain. In this city I used to work in, we had a hospital ghost that would come and visit people before they died. People would call me into their rooms asking why there was a child in there a few minutes ago, and in a day or two, they would pass. Before I was a nurse, I was a nursing assistant at a retirement home. I worked nights, and we had to do hourly rounds on every resident. I had just finished accounting for, except for Henry. Henry was a wheelchair-bound, and was known to be a night owl. He'd scoot around to the very large building and visit the dining room, chapel, day room, and the like. I notified 2 other staff that we had to find Henry. As I did, I saw him on the other end of the hall, in the process of scooting down the other corridor. I told my co-workers, "Oh, there he is." I power walked to meet up with him to check him. As I turned the corner, he was nowhere to be seen. I found him in the chapel room on the other side of the building. He'd been there the whole time, and was never at the end I thought I saw him at. My hospital has some stories. I have two that are personal. Also, I have had several people tell me that the radiology department is haunted by a man in a blue shirt. I have never seen him, but when the televisions in the ER start acting up, like changing channels on their own, volume going up and down, they blame the blue shirt guy from radiology. My first experience happened about 4 months ago. It was early summer, and I worked second shift and park beside the loading dock, so that I don't have to walk all the way across the large parking lot in the middle of the night. Well, I was wandering through the loading dock, which is deserted at that time of night, and all of the lights are off, and I tripped on some signage that was sticking out. It didn't hurt, but it startled me, so I exclaimed, "Shit!" There was no one behind me, no one out in the hall, and like I said, the dock was deserted. Immediately after I exclaimed, I heard a man's voice say, "You all right?" in a concerned voice. I laughed and said, "Yeah," and kept walking. It wasn't until I was halfway to my car outside that I realized there was no one who could have said that to me. This is also right across from radiology, so maybe it was the same dude feeling concerned. The second thing happened 2 nights ago. I have to check the surgical area for specimens in case there are any surgeries after hours. I have to walk through the dark lobby to get to the surgical area, which is no big deal. There is enough light from outside, and this light and water feature to make walking fine. After checking for specimens on Friday, I was heading back to the lab and just glanced over at the gift shop, which has a couple of benches in front of it. I saw a girl with long dark hair sitting on one of the benches. She was just kind of sitting, hunched over, looking down at her feet. It took a heartbeat for my brain to realize I had just seen this, so I had turned away from the gift shop when I realized. I immediately looked back, and there was nothing there. I even walked back a few paces and looked all around to see if it was something that could have tricked my mind into thinking of this shape. But there was literally nothing. Nothing to cast shadows on those benches. This sighting actually really made me uneasy, and I kept looking over my shoulder as I was making my way down the hallway. If it was something supernatural, it was definitely more malignant. The third shift phlebotomist also told me about hearing music in the surgical area one night when she went to go check. She called out, but there was no one around, and she avoids going that way anymore. I've had a lot of run-ins with shadow people. My first run-in was ironically in a hospital. I was a patient and didn't see them myself. I just had major surgery and was sharing a room with a lovely old woman named Geraldine. She was an interesting old woman who kept me highly entertained during my stay. One morning, the nurse was taking my blood pressure, and Geraldine exclaimed that she had seen 3 dark shadows standing around my bed while I slept, just watching. I looked at her thinking she was probably hallucinating from the meds, when I noticed the look on the nurse's face. She then quietly said that she'd seen them stood there too, and it had freaked her out. Geraldine was excited by this, but I was more creeped out. A few months later, I moved into a flat with my boyfriend, which turned out to be extremely haunted, but I won't go into that much right now. And the boyfriend would have a freak out due to seeing a shadow standing in the doorway. I never saw it, but definitely experienced other things. Not long after we moved again to our house, a year goes by and I see a shadow in the broad daylight peep around the door. I wasn't scared, more shocked. And my cat, who was sat next to me, saw it too. A few months later, I wake up in the night to see your stereotypical shadow at the foot of the bed. It's roughly 7 feet tall, just staring, and I initially think I'm having a waking dream. But after 10 minutes of rubbing my eyes, blinking, and trying to figure out what it was, I decide it's actually there. But it's not doing anything malicious, so I try to go back to sleep. I check a few times, and it's still there. In the morning, my boyfriend is having another freak out. He says the shadow grabbed his foot and was standing at the bottom of the bed. I asked him to show me where, and he described it exactly. 3 loud bangs suddenly come from the attic, and we both freak out. Later in the evening, I see it in the mirror in the bathroom, stood behind me. I freak out again. Then nothing for a year or so as far as shadows go, and then I see it 3 times in a week. It starts out at the end of the bed, and each night gets closer. The final time it's leaning right over my bed, with a frigidly pointy hat. By this point, I've had enough, and I sleep downstairs for 2 weeks. Some months go by, and we buy a house and move again. Everything's fine for another year until one night I can't sleep. It's too hot. I get up, grab some water, and go back to bed. I'm laying on top of the covers facing my boyfriend when I feel a cold breeze on my leg. I roll over so I can get into bed, when my head goes into the shadow mass, and I suddenly can't breathe. I'm panicking, and I lunge backwards towards the headboard, and see it stood there before it turns into smoke and disappeared into the ceiling. As soon as it was gone, I could breathe again. Thankfully, that was the last time I've seen one, aside from odd glimpses. They're bloody terrifying. I'm pretty sure that it followed me from the hospital, and I'm glad that it's gone. I was working the night shift as a PRN nurse on a psych ward in 2015. Anyway, it's about 1 a.m, and a tech that was stationed outside the door of a sleeping patient's room, doing a direct line of site observation, comes to the door of the nurse's station with another tech in tow. They both say they just saw a shadow person walk out of room 610, down the hall, and walk into the assistant director's office. I look at my monitor tech, as her job is to watch the panel of cameras in the unit. She nods. Yeah, I saw it too, on the camera. Now I'm super jelly. Everyone's always talking about the shit they've seen, and yet I've never seen a thing. So I decide to walk down there and peek into the window of the door to see what I can see. Well, I immediately regretted it. Let me explain. I've been down that hall at least 10,000 times, probably more, but something is decidedly off. Yeah, it gets cold, colder than it's ever been. Not even winter, but it's more like that. Each step is harder to take than the last. I can feel something oppressive, something heavy. I'm starting to get tightness in my chest. I feel hate. The feel of something hating. Pure undulating hate. It wanted me to know it wasn't human. It never has been human, and it hates all humans. I'm starting to consider turning around. I look back, and the entire crew is staring at the nurse's station, peeking at their heads around the door watching me. I can't chicken out in front of that many people, and I keep walking. I get about 5 feet away from the door, and I have feelings of impending doom. I'm almost sure I'm gonna die right then and there, and I can't will myself any closer to that door. About that time, the blinds in the windows in the door open all by themselves, and I see a face, an outline. It's got a cone-shaped head, like someone in a hood maybe, or perhaps robes, and a mouth frozen in an eternal scream, and giant holes where its eyes should have been. I turn around and start running back towards the nurse's station, and back towards other people, and I never looked back. When I get there, they say I was white as a sheet, shaky, mumbling, and had cold sweat beads. The monitor tech shows me the footage. It's some kind of misty black fog that chased me about 150 feet down the hall and disappeared at around 610, and everybody saw it. The administration of the hospital tell me that I cannot have a copy of the footage, and says that it can't have the hospital getting a bad reputation, especially the psych ward. Fine, I'll record the footage on my phone next time I work. But nope, they went ahead and deleted it. But I do have about 7 good witnesses who saw it all. I personally have not seen or heard anything paranormal on the hospital I currently work at. However, there are stories. Of course, from other nurses, doctors, and techs. They share them, and one has always stuck with me. I first heard the story from an ER nurse that has been there for years, and prior to that, his father used to work in the same hospital, but up in the floors. That's where the story takes place. The oath that they swear to is backed up by some of the older floor nurses, that some of the patients that stay here for several days tell the nurses they are visited by a nun. Now, the hospital pastor does not stay overnight, and all of these stories take place during the overnight shifts. When the nurses do their rounds and ask if the patients need anything, they would state their answer and would state something along the lines of, "No, I feel fine. Talking to the nun really helped, blah blah blah." Obviously, the nurses at first would try to explain that there aren't any pastors or nuns around at those hours. But after time, they just stopped. They would explain that after asking the patients if they felt fine or threatened by the nun, they would say it was the opposite, and would feel at peace and felt better now that they had a conversation with her. All the patients could swear they spoke to, saw one, and were visited by a nun. This has been going on for years. However, I haven't heard any new stories about said nun for a while, but the thought of it just gives me chills and makes me especially observant when I visit the upper floors.